a lot of questions about how we manage, how we, retain civil society when the major means of communication in our country have become so distorted by a lot of censorship. The big tech companies are saying that they're entitled to content moderation and they can kind of set things up the way they want to. But there are a couple of states that are fighting back. Florida has created a law, as well as Texas, in terms of governing how these big tech companies can moderate themselves. And that was the subject of a Supreme Court case today. It was heard today. It's called Net Choice v. Moody and Net Choice v. Paxton. They're tied together, involving both Florida and Texas. And the Washington Examiner reports today that the Supreme Court justices appear skeptical of Republican states in this major internet free speech case. They say Florida's law would allow residents to take legal action in the state to fine companies if they remove political candidates from social media platforms. The Texas law would require platforms to be content neutral and allow the state's attorney general and residents to sue platforms for removing content or blocking accounts. For more on this, I want to bring in Carl Szabo now. He's the vice president and general counsel for NetChoice and a professor of internet law at George Mason University's Scalia Law School. Carl, thank you so much for your time today. Good to have you with us, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So it sounds like your side had some success today in front of the justices. Give us the case for why it's important that these laws in both Florida and Texas don't stand.
Yeah, it's a pretty simple concept. The government should not ever be able to force any American, whether they are online or offline, to say something they don't want to say or block them from saying something they want to say. And that's basically the question before the court. Do online businesses, in this case, social media platforms as small as Rumble, for example,
right,
including Etsy, retain the right to decide what type of content is appropriate for their businesses, for their advertisers, and for their customers? Or can the government come in and force them to host content that they never want to be associated with, they don't even want to discuss? And that's the question before the court. And the best example of that would be if you look at the state of Florida and the requirement that websites must host political speech, regardless of what they want to do. You could have a sports website that would be required to host political content. One of the examples that was used and discussed during the court discussion today was that Etsy, who would be covered by the Florida law, would be required by law to allow shirts with swastikas on it on their marketplace. And that would be bad not only for the brand Etsy, who doesn't want to be associated with Nazis, it would be bad for every other seller on that platform who now has their content, their product, their creation associated with Nazis. Yet, that is what is at issue today because the state of Florida decided, no, we want to allow Nazis to have a platform. And
right,
that's a violation of the First Amendment, and that's why we are bringing this suit.
Right, but even people who say that they're Nazis, they are allowed to have that opinion, as stupid as it might be, right?
Oh, 100%. They are allowed to have that opinion. I am just not required to post them on my site, just like I'm not required
right,
to buy a business, open up a discussion center, and allow anyone and everyone to speak, even if I consider their speech completely vile, to talk. And one of the other simpler analogies is, we're coming up on campaign season. A lot of front yard signs are coming out. Well, should a politician be allowed to just put their sign in my front yard, even if I don't like the politician, even if I don't support the politician, or even if I don't support that political issue? Of course not. So why should it be any different for a private business?
Right.
Why should it be any different for a private business online?
But I guess a lot of this revolves around, of course, the public interest here, because my front yard is not in everyone's front yard, right? Whereas these social media companies have an immense amount of power to both inform and to conceal to the American voter. And we learned that in very real terms, especially with the Hunter Biden laptop saga in 2020. And if you have, for instance, in the case of political candidates, like right here on this radio station, as we near an election, we have equal time obligations. If we allow a candidate to be on, we also have an obligation to allow their opponent to be on under similar circumstances. Should there not be a similar requirement for the biggest communications platforms in our countries that very much do affect what the voters even know about their elections?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So let me start at the end and move backwards. The radio is treated substantially different from almost any other medium, except for maybe broadcast television. And that was decided back in the 70s in a case called Red Line. That's because of the limited scarcity of spectrum allocation, basically the airwaves they use to transmit radio. So newspapers, for example, are not subject to the same requirements. Cable companies are not subject to the same requirements. But because TV and radio is limited, they were able to kind of do an end run around the First Amendment. When it comes to the internet is everything but limited. If you don't like what's going on Facebook, you can go to YouTube. If you don't like YouTube, you go to X. If you don't like X, you go to Rumble. If you don't like Rumble, you go to True Social, and on and on and on and on. So the choice and competition is fierce. Now, going back to the first half of that question, which centers on the right of businesses to decide what's best for their users and their customers with respect to the Hunter Biden laptop story. So that's an issue that hits me directly. I was part of the group of people who were part of that first tranche of emails dumped by Matt Taibbi, where NetChoice was warning X, or Twitter at the time, that people on the Hill were hopping mad. But that is exactly why we have to win this case at the U.S. Supreme Court. Because what you saw with Twitter and the Hunter Biden laptop was government coercion, was the government coming in and trying to censor speech. And that was because the Biden administration does not believe the First Amendment necessarily applies to social media platforms. There's actually a case being brought by the states of Missouri and Louisiana against the Biden administration before the court in about 2 weeks, Supreme Court in about 2 weeks on that issue. So that is why NetChoice is fighting this, because we don't want the government to be able to force us to say something we don't want to say. And at the same time, we don't want the government to be in a position to censor us. So if you don't think that the Biden administration or any government official should be able to forbid content to be on the internet, then you have to say the First Amendment applies to social media platforms, even when they do things that you don't like.
So is it your view, I think it is, if I understand you correctly, Carl Szabo, that so a company like Google, if they decided that they wanted to censor certain categories of communication or certain categories of information, even if they did it explicitly because they wanted to affect the results of an election, they're entitled to do that. But if the government tries to compel their behavior to moderate speech, then that's not allowed. That's a violation of the First Amendment.
Completely right. And that's why NetChoice is out there trying to advance and supports legislation like Protecting Free Speech from Government Interference Act from Chairman Jordan, Republican House, basically making it illegal for the government to engage in coercive pressure. That's why we filed an amicus brief in the Missouri and Louisiana case against the Biden administration, because we do not want any government, left, right, or center, being able to control speech on the internet. And yes, as a conservative, which I am, as a Republican, which I am, does it frustrate me when those businesses make decisions that I don't like? Absolutely. But my conservative principles say I do not want the government to be able to control speech, because while I may like what they're doing today, I will certainly hate what they are doing when the shoe is on the other foot.
I understand that impulse. I'm very hesitant about the government having any more concentrated power. In fact, I'm suspicious of all concentrations of power, including the big tech companies, quite honestly. Carl Szabo, I really appreciate your time today, and congratulations, it sounds like, on how the court reacted to it. We'll see what the final decision is when it finally comes out. But, Carl, good to have you with us. Thank you, sir.